Hey folks, it's your buddy Mike Messier here on One Pro Wrestling and Sports Fan YouTube channel. Also, we'll be replaying this on One Mike Messier. And I am here with a gentleman who has his own website, dirkmanning.com. That's DIRKMANNING.com. Dirk Manning is the writer creator of comic series such as the Supernatural Noir, Tales of Mr. Ree. Do I have that
Yeah.
correct, Dirk? And the genre bending horror anthology Nightmare World. More of Dirk's comic work includes Buried But Not Dead, which was nominated for a Ringo Award as Best Original Graphic Novel of 2021. Twisted Haunted Highons. Butts in Seats, the Tony Schiavone story of one of our favorite commentators in pro wrestling. Hope. The Adventures of, help me with this one,
Uh,
Chichulo,
Cthulhu Jr.
Yep, Chichulo Jr. and Friends, and Love Stories, parenthesis, to Die For. Now predominantly publishing with Source Point Press, where he also serves as Special Projects Manager. Dirk was an early adopter in using crowdfunding to launch pre-sales of his comics and graphic novels, with Dirk's work having raised over $480,000 and counting in pre-sales on Kickstarter alone. Dirk is also the author of the inspirational how-to column turned book series Right or Wrong, a writer's guide to creating comics, and has contributed several short stories to the role-playing game series Clockwork Dominion for Requillery Game Studios. His screenplay writings include the YouTube horror series Black Box TV episode The Hunger, which was directed by Drew Daywalt and featuring Bonnie Aarons and John Grease. So, coming into us all the way from Detroit, Michigan, is Mr. Dirk Manning. How are you, Dirk?
Very good, man. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I'm very happy to talk to you because I was one of those Kickstarter people that supported the book, Arn Anderson. I've got the hardcover here, and there's also a paperback. And I think people, to tell you the truth, Dirk, I think your project with Arn Anderson, My Life as the Enforcer, is the second crowdfunding project I've ever supported.
All right on. Well, thank you, man. I appreciate that. And as you mentioned, doing the crowdfunding, you actually got the limited edition hardcover version of the book, the trade paperback, and you also got a copy of that. This is the version that's going to be available now, in stores, not Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and all that good stuff, comic shops. But the hardcover edition that you have is like the early adapter, right? Bonus. You people that back the Kickstarter get the hardcover, and so I'm really excited you jumped in and got that because this is a book that me and my team and Arn are really especially proud of.
Yes, and it's interesting, Dirk, because I believe going way back to 1997, I want to say, or 98, or maybe 2001, Arn published a paperback book, like a memoir, right?
Yeah, like yeah.
And it
The
was I had that too. I had a copy of that, and I think I have another copy somewhere. And Arn's memoir is, I think it's called Forever, and it's just so funny because he's like struggling with not breaking kayfabe in the
right,
book.
right. Yeah, it's a
And
very in character book, right?
right, and I'm reading this thing even back then, and I'm thinking, like, he kind of like got me because it's like, as an old school wrestling fan, I appreciate what he's trying to do or what he's doing. He's not giving away all the secrets, yet he's still telling the story. And I think through his podcast, which I listened to, Arn Anderson and Paul Bromwell on 80 on the Ad Free Show network with Arn Show. I listen to those guys every week, and I love how Arn breaks down his career month by month. So it's when they started talking about this comic and everything on with Paulie B on the show, I got intrigued. And like I said, as an old school wrestling fan, Arn Anderson's one of those guys that he could work any match on the card. He could work the opening match, and he could work the main event. And as a fan, it was totally acceptable for either way.
No, you're exactly right. And it's funny when this book first came to fruition, which I don't think would be a surprise to most people that know the history of what I do. This book kind of came out directly as a result of me doing Butts and Seats, the Tony Schiavone story. And Arn, kind of as a rib, I met him and he's like, when am I going to get a comic book? And I'm like, okay, yeah, that sounds great, man. Let's do that. And again, as you read in my bio, predominantly in my career to date, I've been known as a horror comic writer, doing the Tales of Mystery, Nightmare World, stuff like that. But I've always been a huge wrestling fan since I was little. And working with Tony Schiavone um, on that book was really fun. Then you got a guy like Arn Anderson, totally different animal, right? Totally different way of telling the story. And again, I was really fascinated to tell the story about with Butts and Seats. We got to tell the story. My working title for Butts and Seats was A Life Amongst Giants. Because here's Tony, a guy who's objectively not a wrestler, but more of like a normal guy navigating through this life with these giant personalities and sometimes these physically giant characters. Arn is the giant, right? Right. Arn is the wrestler. Arn is the guy. So now to kind of walk that back and then talk about what is it like to be the enforcer and what is it like to live your life as in many ways the guy behind the guy. Arn's a guy you can plug in anywhere. Like you said, he can be the opener, he can be the headliner. He had one of the biggest pops in WrestleMania history when he spinebustered The Undertaker, and everyone thought that was going to be the moment the streak ended, right? Against Ric Flair, right?
Yeah.
But getting to tell the story about the real person behind the character was an opportunity I couldn't say no to, and as a result, the book that we created with this, which again, now you can now order this on Amazon, through Barnes and Nobles, through comic book shops. Um, it's a fascinating and beautiful story that I think that even people who are not necessarily wrestling fans are really going to find a lot to invest in this book. Um, Arn is a natural storyteller, both in the ring, obviously, but also just personally, and him making the very vulnerable decision to open up the book by saying, "Let me tell you about my life when I was little, and the fact that I didn't know my father, and that my mom, no offense to his mom, kind of abandoned me,
Right.
and my grandparents raised me." That's not the normal tough way guy, the tough guy story that you hear, right? Um, and then as a result, when he takes you through this journey, and he starts talking about becoming a professional wrestler and being gifted the moniker of being an Anderson, and then all this stuff, and then the injuries he had, things like that. It's a hell of a story, and illustrated by Colm Griffin and Sean Daly, these two amazing illustrators, doing both. With Sean doing the present day Arn, and then flashing back to Colm stuff doing the past Arn. I'm exceptionally proud of this book, and I'm really excited that everyone that's been reading it has had such a very strong, positive reaction to it. And I'm glad this book exists, and that it's not the kayfabe version of the old book that he wrote. This is its own. This is its own beast.
Yeah. And I find that if you're a fan of professional wrestling in general, but especially if you're from the '80s generation. But I keep telling the younger wrestling fans, Dirk, they've got to study the history because to have an
Mm-hmm.
appreciation of what the sport has been through. I mean, Arn Anderson was at Starrcade '85 with Ole Anderson against Wahoo McDaniel and Billy Jack Haynes. He was at the Great American
Right,
Bash show. I mean, to appreciate because the NXT is still using the Great American Bash for their
right.
events now, 30, 40 years later. And it's just amazing. And one thing about Arn's life that I think he always does a good job of mentioning on the podcast, in this graphic novel, in his prior book, the relationship of two women, particularly his grandmother, who essentially raised him as if he
Yep.
was her child, and his wife, Erin. Uh,
Yes.
and uh, and I think, to Arn's credit and to Erin's credit, uh, they have lived through a lot of stuff. They have stayed together through thick and thin, and from all accounts, probably one of the most successful marriages of a pro wrestler. Be, be, and
Right.
I'm not trying to put down the other wrestlers, but some of these guys have walked the aisle 5 or 6 times, let's say, and
Sure.
Arn and Anderson are still going strong. So I think that Arn Anderson always puts a lot of value on the women of his life, starting with Granny, and then Aaron, his wife, and it's just and I think Arn's very well respected by the female wrestlers of today, both in AEW and prior to that at WWE, as a guy that, as an agent, because he did do a lot of work as an agent too,
Hmm.
um, he was always very helpful to them.
Yeah, Arn. The thing about Arn is he's a gentleman. He is a gentleman, and having the conversations I've had with him, um, not to peel back the curtain too much, but this book was done a long time before it was delivered. It got stuck in customs, which is just something that happens sometimes. I mean, the book was just sitting on a vat in a port for months, and times of adversity really, I think, ultimately show someone's true character. And Arn, through this whole process from beginning to end, I just talked to Arn on the phone the other day. Now that the book is out, and he's going to start doing signings and conventions with the book in hand. A gentleman. He is a true, consummate professional. And as a result, it was no, but I think that part of this is by being raised by his grandmother, having a strong relationship with his wife. That's testament to character, right? And me, this guy that came in and he entrusted to tell the story and work with him on this project. The book is done and out. We could never speak again, but he gives me a call and we start talking about some stuff and things like that. And through the whole thing, truly, truly a gentleman, and that gentle, kind Arn Anderson that you see in this book, that's him. That is him. And obviously now we're recently with him departing with AEW and what's going to be next for him. Anybody that has the opportunity to work with Arn through mentorship or in any capacity it would be a better person, I would argue, for doing so.
Well,
What you see is what you get, man. He's that guy. He's just a nice, kind, compassionate person.
I got to tell you, Dirk, now with Cody Rhodes winning that Royal Rumble last night for the second time, what better placement than to have Arn Anderson rekindle the magic that Arn had as Cody's manager. And if you had Arn Anderson in Cody's corner this year for WrestleMania, maybe things will be a bit different against Roman Reigns, right?
From your lips to God's ears, man. Because I'll tell you what, they're finish the story, right?
Right.
Finish the story, and we even referenced it in the book very sublimely. But Arn's famous Glock promo with
Yes.
Cody back in the day,
Right.
and that came out around the time that we were working on the book together, and it was like, holy crap! Whoa! He's like, yeah, it's good to remind people that sometimes we still got it, right? And I would love nothing more than to see Arn come back in WWE and do that and continue to lend. He's got such a mind for the business.
Right.
And what's unique about one of the things I think that's most unique about Arn, and I think this was like a subplot to the whole book, but maybe this didn't come out perhaps as inherently as I envisioned it would when I started the project. Arn has always been the guy behind the guy. Arn is the guy that makes other people better just by his presence of being there. And that's not to take away from any of Arn's many accomplishments as a wrestler, as a solo wrestler, as a tag team wrestler. Arn Anderson is a foundational element of the professional wrestling landscape as we see it today. But he's also has never been a Ric Flair, a Hulk Hogan, even like a John Cena in regards to the face of the company. And he will joke, and he'll make. I can hear Arn in my head right now making jokes. Well, you wouldn't want this face to be the face of, right? But every good, and again, I'm going to use a comic book analogy here. Every good comic book villain is oftentimes defined by their henchman, by their muscle, by their enforcer,
Right.
right? And oftentimes, the main villain in a comic book, especially, is not as fearsome as their henchman, as their enforcer. And that was Arn. I mean, Ric Flair, incredible wrestler, one of the goats. But would Ric Flair have been Ric Flair without Arn Anderson, without the Four Horsemen? I mean, arguably yes, but there's still a very huge value added component to what Arn Anderson, the performer, brings to what he does. And you'll notice in the book, we're very sparingly referred to Arn by his legal name.
Right.
And I did that on purpose. Not that it's not public information. It is. Everyone knows that Arn Anderson is not his legal name. He's Martin Lundy. But the book was about Arn Anderson and what being Arn Anderson entails personally and professionally. So that when we do see Aaron in the book, when he first meets Aaron, when we do the modern takes, when he's there with his little dog and his wife and his kids and stuff like that, we talk about that. But his mind for wrestling, coming back to what I was saying originally, is so, his knowledge of wrestling is so profound, and his mind is so sharp on that stuff that again, not to be a mark about it, but I would love to see him come back in WWE to help Cody finish the story. I think that would be an amazing part of this and a recognition of what he can bring to this next generation of wrestlers. Um, Watching the Rumble yesterday, look how much young talent we had. We didn't have any real legend throwback stuff in either Royal Rumble event.
Right.
When's the last time that happened? When's the last time you didn't have the pop of the old guy coming back in? The
Right.
pops were the new people. The pops were the Jade Cargills. The pops were the Andrades, right? So bringing Arn into that mix as well. Not to be too much of a fanboy about it, but again, from your lips to God's ears, and from your lips to Triple H's ears, let's do that. Let's bring him back home and let him really continue to grow the industry like someone like only in his position can.
Well, you know that Triple H has a huge respect for Arn Anderson. I believe that the Evolution Group, I think Arn is credited with naming the Evolution Group of Triple H, Ric Flair, Batista, and Randy Orton. And then uh, Triple H, I want to say around the 2000 era, started using one of Arn's custom moves, the Spine Buster.
Mindbuster. Yep.
And I mean, Ron Simmons used the spine buster, but they all give credit to Arn Anderson because basically he invented the spine buster. And
Yeah.
I
Hey,
can
we
go
talked about that
back
in the
and
book. Yeah.
yeah, I can remember he was using the gourd buster, which was like he would lift a guy up for a suplex and then drop him forward.
Stop.
But Dirk, we're both huge Arn Anderson fans. I'm so happy for you in this book, but I do want to talk about some of your other stuff because
Sure, man.
I have it's interesting for me as a pop culture enthusiast. When I was a kid, I was really into comics until I got into pro wrestling. And that's when pro wrestling kind of took over. The only cartoon I would watch after I got into wrestling was Alvin and the Chipmunks because that was on at 10:30, and then the
Right.
WWF was on at 11. And so
Right. There's your lead
every
in.
right, exactly, it was a lead. The Chipmunks led in. Alvin and Theodore led in to
Yeah.
wrestling. But I'm telling you, before that, I was collecting, the Donald Duck comics, Richie Rich. I was a big Richie Rich fan, and I was also a huge fan of things like Ghost, and I think there was one. I want to say the Whitman comics had like these horror comics,
Yep. Yep.
and
Yep.
the stories were really quite good, and they were short, but they had some real good horror elements to them. And I remember one of the few times I went camping as a kid with my cousins, I actually somehow got put in as the lead storyteller around the campfire, and I was telling the stories I had read in the comics.
Right. Right.
So in my recent years, I kind of get on eBay and I kind of like start revisiting my childhood, and I started buying some of the ghost stories and some of the Ripley's comics and some of this other stuff from my childhood and even before, like stuff going back to the 70s. And as you talk about your work with Arn Anderson, but really coming from the horror world, and I wrote a graphic novel, or I wrote a novel, A Distance from Avalon, a horror book. I've got to think that Your background in horror is something I'd like to hear more about. So, can you tell me about how you got into horror and how you've made this a career for yourself?
Yeah, yeah. My first comic series I ever published is titled Nightmare World, which is very much a throwback to a lot of those old horror anthologies you talk about. Um, and what's funny is now this year we're doing the 20th anniversary edition of that book through Source Point Press called Nightmare World: The Complete Collection, which again available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, wherever books are sold. You can check that out. Um, but I've always been, before I was a comic person, even I was a horror person. I used to watch, again, that's something Art and I have in common was my grandparents were very involved in helping raise me as well. When I was younger, I was fortunate enough to have a relationship with my parents, but my grandparents were a big part of that. And some of my earliest memories when I was little was watching The Twilight Zone with my great grandmother, right? And I loved the idea of many of the Twilight Zones were put two people in a room, but then twist the room, right? Put them in unusual circumstances. And Rod Sterling is one of the greatest American storytellers of all time, bar none. That is not up for debate as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
So, yeah, my background is very much as a horror person first. And I didn't discover comics till I was about 13 years old. The reason I discovered comics is because I was such a voracious reader. I loved the idea that if I could find stories I was invested in, I'd get new content every month. That was the first thing to me. I would go to the library and like literally be like reading all the books on the shelves and like I don't want to say something as grandiose as the library is running out of books for me, but they're running out of books for the stuff I liked,
Right. Right.
right? You only read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea so many times. Like, I want something else. I want more stuff like this. I want more of this Ray Bradbury stuff. I want more Edgar Allan Poe stuff. I want more, later Harlan Ellison stuff, right? But, more Stephen King stuff, more Clive Barker stuff. I'm like, just mainlining this stuff. Give it to me. Give it to me. So comics became a thing. What do you mean there's always going to be more? That fascinated me. And then I started really start to appreciate the medium, about how you can tell stories in words and pictures and the juxtaposition of words and pictures. So then I started getting into stuff like some of the masters of the form, like Alec Allen Moore, who juxtaposes so well in books like Watchmen, right? Or then I read The Crow by James O'Barr, which, I mean, the sheer passion he puts on the page. A lot of people are familiar with the movie The Crow and the franchise of The Crow. You read that original graphic novel, James O'Barr bled on those pages, and that became a very instrumental piece of me learning to appreciate and love comics. And then the third part of that trifecta for me was Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, which a lot of people know Frank Miller went on to do things like 300 and stuff like that, Sin City. But the idea that you could take something like Batman, which, like a lot of people, I was most familiar with, like the 60s, Adam West TV show, but make it very gritty and realistic and extrapolate out on this and dense. My parents bought me The Dark Knight Returns as a Christmas present. My mom's like, well, I know you're starting to read comics and I know you read fast. So this is a thick one. This one should take you a minute. Right.
Right.
But you take all that and then you combine that with my love of horror. And that's really what started my career as a comic book writer with Nightmare World, which again, 20 years later now, it's being re-released again through Source Point Press in this big definitive trade paperback edition of the whole series. Other horror stuff I've done is like Tales of Mystery, which is more of like a supernatural noir, which again, the play on words, Tales of
Right.
Mystery, like throwback to the old books, right?
Yep.
Uh, we just did the 5th volume of that on Kickstarter recently. It's about a paranormal troubleshooter who hunts monsters, and with that book, I really wanted to explore. There's hundreds of stories out there about people that hunt monsters. You go back all the way back to like Van Helsing and Dracula, for God's sake, right? But my thing with that, or modern like John Constantine Hellblazer. But my thing has always been, what would it really be like to be that person? How do you make friends? What do you do? Oh, I hunt monsters. How do I know you're not a monster? Let me throw like holy water on you, right? All the time. Anybody I meet, first date, okay? How does this cross affect you? Holy water, this, that, can I see your reflection? And I wanted to really explore what that life would do to someone and ultimately the trauma that would put that person through and how do they function in society. And that's become Tales of Mystery, which is my longest running franchise to date. Like I said, Volume 5 just came out. It's available through bookstores and things like that. I love comics as a medium. I love horror as a genre. And as a result, that's become a real foundational element of what I've done. In more recent years, again, along with the wrestling books, I've branched out. I did, you mentioned earlier, um, my first all ages book, which not surprisingly is a horror book, all ages horror book,
Oh, here we go.
The Adventures of Cthulhu Jr. and Friends, right?
Yeah.
Um, Still very much a DIRK Manning production, but this is more fun and more funny. And even even looking at now, there's stuff that makes me laugh on this.
Right.
Uh, I started working with Twisted on Haunted Highons, which both volumes of the book were nominated for Ringo Awards as Best Humor Comic. It's a supernatural book, but it's funny. And as much as a wrestling fan I am, I have a book coming out again later this year, a re-release of a series that I did that's out of print called Love Stories to Die For. That has a wrestling story in it, which is kind of a horror story as well. Um, but ultimately, through and through, I'm a horror guy because, to me, the genre of horror, I think, addresses the human condition very well by answering the question, what would you do if?
Right.
To me, that's the foundation of a good horror story. That's the foundation of good of dynamic fiction, and I can best explore that through, you know, books like Tales of Mystery, horror books, right? So here I sit. Last year was my 20th anniversary as a published comic book writer. Arn
Nice.
Anderson was my 20th graphic novel in my career. Not to mention little side things I've done, and I'm very fortunate to be in this position to continue to do this work.
That's awesome. And a lot of stuff you said there we could dive into. I'm interested in how you've used the internet crowdsourcing, Kickstarter, these mediums that, when you and I were kids didn't exist, but here they are,
Yeah.
and you've used them to great heights. Tell me some of your thoughts on that about crowdsourcing, crowdfunding. Tell me some of your insights in that world.
Yeah, I was, and sometimes people might get tired of me saying this, but I was really one of the OGs of crowdfunding comics. And the reason is because when I first started publishing Nightmare World, I started publishing it as an online comic. I did not target comic book readers with my work. I targeted horror readers. Like you said, people that maybe knew about comics from like Richie Rich or G.I. Joe, whatever it was, but showing them the foundation. When you look at the history of comic books, horror is always a thread. Your Tales from the Crypt, your Creepies, your Eerie's, Ghosts. Any publisher ever has published horror anthologies at some point, right? Well, what I found was a lot of the people that enjoyed my work online did not necessarily go to comic book shops, right? And as a result, when I would try to take like Nightmare World to publishers, especially at the time when I was starting the series, horror comics and on top of that, horror anthology style comics were seen as kind of like short stories, kind of seen like the ghetto of comics, right? Like, oh, well, we need filler, we'll put in a short story. Go back to what I said earlier. I grew up reading Ray Bradbury, Edgar Allan Poe, people that their bread and butter was short stories. And I loved that stuff. And I think it's harder to write a good short story than it is to write a good long story. So I quickly realized that I was kind of beating my head against the walls with publishers to an extent. And that's not to say I didn't get published. I did. But I realized ultimately I had to demonstrate that there was a bigger audience there than perhaps the comic book publishing market was tapping into.
Right.
So Nightmare World, the first 3 volumes got published by Image Comics, who published The Walking Dead, and they published, they're one of the biggest publishers of creator-owned content out there. But they wouldn't publish the 4th book to finish the series because the direct market sales were not there. And Jim Valentino, who I work with at Image, even said, he goes, you onesie twosies these book out, you get on the road, he goes, you can sell your books left and right, but that doesn't work for what we're doing in the comic book stores. So I went to Devil's Due, and he let me do crowdfunding. And we set a crowdfunding record for creator-owned books for the publisher with Nightmare World. We did over $45,000 in pre-sales in 30 days. which is not anything to sneeze at, as
No,
far as
it's
I'm
not.
concerned.
Yeah.
Um, but it demonstrated again, there's an audience for my work there. And in a lot of ways now, crowdfunding has become the great equalizer for creators. Um, the Tony Schiavone book, Butts and Seats, we did over 130,000 on Kickstarter. I don't know if we would have released that book directly into the direct market first, we would have had the kind of reaction we had versus Kickstarter. Because again, a lot of Tony's fans didn't ever go to a comic shop, didn't even read a comic book, but they like Tony, so they
Right.
bought the book. Like you yourself were saying, this is only your second ever crowdfunder. You're a fan of Arn Anderson, so you're like, oh, Arn's doing a graphic novel. I don't know a lot about Kickstarter and stuff, but I can get a cool hardcover edition of this book. Great. And that's the other thing that I love about crowdfunding is it allows me to do things that I can't necessarily do in the direct market. So case in point, uh, like Haunted Highlands is another example of this. When we did pre-sales for this book, we could do a leather bound hardcover edition, you know,
Right.
ribbon bookmarks. We can do these fancy collector's editions of the book. But then when we do the book in the direct market, we can do the trade paperback, something that more people are more traditionally used to. And again, they can spend, 20 bucks or so on this, but the fans can get the limited edition hardcover version, which comic book stores may not inherently support what we're doing on something like this. So to me, that's the real power of Kickstarter is it allows us to directly sell to the consumer deluxe editions of the books, a little bit fancier collector's editions, but then allow us to still do, you know, trade paperbacks later for the mass market.
Let me ask you a technical question on that because I did enjoy the ribbon that came with the Arn Anderson hardcover that I
Yeah,
got as and my because I actually used it last night because I read about
there it is.
2/3 of the book last night and then
Yeah,
I was happily surprised at the density of the storytelling. So I put the ribbon in there and I picked
right.
it up just as Arn got to Charlotte, so to speak. So my
Yeah.
question is just a technical thing. You said that comic book stores may not fully support the hardcover, and this is just my guess. Before you
Mhm.
answer, is it because in a comic book store traditionally you have the guy putting his fingers through the rows and rows of books like in a record store, and so maybe these hardcovers are just they take up too much space or they're too fancy because so many people are just used to perusing, or why exactly would the hardcover not 100% be appreciated or supported by comic book stores?
I think one of the things you'll see is with the hardcovers, there's obviously a higher price point on a hardcover traditionally. Also, to be fair, despite 20 years in this industry and the success I've had, I've never written for Marvel. I've never written for DC. I have taken a very non-traditional path in doing primarily creator-owned work my whole career. I'm not a household name to comic book people. If I went and played the game and tried to go write Thor or Batman or whatever, something like that, my name value in the industry would be a lot higher to retailers because like they said, oh yeah, he wrote that X-Men book for a minute and it was good. Am I a better writer by writing X-Men? Not really. I mean, I'm just playing with someone else's toys for a minute, right? So as a result, I think asking comic book stores to order a limited edition deluxe higher price point hardcover version of a book from a writer that they're not inherently familiar with is a bit of a gamble, right? And again, with your hardcovers, you get a signed book plate. You got a book plate signed by Arn, signed by me, signed by the two artists. That book plate traveled around the world, my friend. So that book went from me to Arn to Canada to Ireland and back. That's right. There it is, right there, right? How
So
cool. You get 4 signatures on that. That's not something we can necessarily do in the direct market, right? I mean, they don't want to keep track of like people opening the book and taking out the book plate and stealing it or whatever else. So I get it. So it's always very important to offer, and again, I'll look at this from a music perspective. If I really like a band, I might want to buy the deluxe edition of the album, like the bonus tracks and like the bonus book and things like that. Right? I'm sitting you in a room. I still collect CDs. I love that stuff. But for the casual fans who don't want to go all in. You offer a nice, affordable trade paperback, 20, 25 bucks. Like you said, nice, dense story, none of the extras. But through comic book stores, ones that know that maybe they built up a relationship with me professionally, or that their customers are familiar with my work, they may want to go all in and go, by the way, we got a deluxe edition of that new Dirk Manning book. But the common stores, because I have not become a household name, again, because it sounds terrible. I'm not trying to put myself over. I've been nominated for 3 Ringo Awards, which is kind of cool, or been nominated for the Ringo Award 3 times with books I've written. I've had a #1 best-selling book on Amazon. Butts and Seats was the first ever graphic novel, original graphic novel advertised on cable television. That doesn't mean as much to the casual comic fan as if I wrote Spider-Man or Batman.
Right.
And no offense, that's not my career goal to write Spider-Man or Batman. I'm just, it's cool. I've had flirtations about writing major corporate characters, but I've got so much time. And there's things I want to do. And again, I want to finish Tales of Mystery. Nightmare World, Hope, Cthulhu Jr., working with Arn and Tony and Twisted. And I've got a book coming out this year with the Lon Chaney estate. That's my jam. I'm not poo-pooing. I'm not dismissing corporate superhero books. Again, I write my own superhero book. I do a book called Hope, which is a superhero book. It's a creator-owned book. This is where my attention is. But as a result, I completely understand the fact that that does not make me a household name to every comic book store yet, although my name is growing. So they don't want to order the fancy, more expensive version. And that's cool. I'm going to give you the trade paperback, the common version that, like you said, people can pick it up and leaf through it.
Right.
And you don't have to protect it because it's not a fancy hardcover with a ribbon bookmark and gold gilded pages and stuff like that. So I think that's a lot of the reason why.
I get it, and I mean, when you're talking, so many things come to mind. I mean, you've probably heard of these guys. When I was a young man, once upon a time, I saw a band in concert for $5 called Fugazi.
There it
And
is.
Fugazi was like I believe they were from D.C., Washington,
Yeah.
D.C. They
Yep.
were like ahead of their time, probably by about 25 years, as far
Oh
as
yeah.
the do it yourself. We were printing our own LPs, we're printing our own 45 records. We're
Mm-hmm.
touring the country in these unofficial venues. Like I saw them in kind of an unofficial, like basically a house,
Or
right?
like a house or a gym, right?
Yeah, I basically saw them in somebody's big house in Greensboro, North Carolina, and $5, and I'm telling you, it's just. But they were big and DIY. When people hear that, I
Right.
don't. I'll be honest with you, Dirk. I mean, kids these days with TikTok and everything else at their disposal, YouTube Shorts and everything, these things weren't around when I was an angry young man. You know what I mean? And
Right.
and I give you a lot of credit because you've done well with this stuff. Whereas myself in filmmaking, I actually got very frustrated with Indiegogo and Kickstarter. The few times that I try to do them with projects, and I'm really appreciative because I know that it's not as simple as, hey, we're going to put a Kickstarter up this weekend and everyone's going to give us their money and then we're going to all be rich and famous and live happily ever after. It's
Mm-hmm.
this constant work, and it's trying, like what I think you've done here is you've have a track record of success, and most importantly, in my mind, Dirk, coming through with the product, because I have seen this happen in the film world, not in the comic world, but in the film world, of people making a lot of projects, promises for their projects, and they don't fulfill them. And then what happens is there's a residual butterfly effect that people don't want to support these films. But when you've
Absolutely.
done the consistency and giving people what they came for and more than their paid value, in my opinion, a lot of times, you're making people happy and you're continuing to grow.
Thank you. And that's it. Crowdfunding is very much a contract, like anything is. And I'm very fortunate. I've gotten to the point that people trust me, that I'm going to come through. Usually I over deliver. It's a fault, but um, That's exactly it. The key is communication, right? We talked about this earlier. This book should have been in people's hands a lot sooner. And what happened is the book gets print. The printing industry went sideways for a while with COVID and everything else. And I hate to keep using that word, but it's just true. The ripple effect was huge. Um, all of you as passive consumers may not care that that paper was hard to find, but you need to know because it's delaying getting the book printed. And then the book gets printed. We finally get it overseas, and then it gets stuck in customs. I let everybody know through Kickstarter updates. I'm like, here's what's going on, friends. Here's what's going on. Years ago when we did Nightmare World, we were getting ready to ship the book from China because that's where we printed that one, and there was a hurricane, and they couldn't send the boat. Now, have you ever seen the joke, the slow boat from China? Those
Right.
freight boats, that's what they are. They're like an apartment complex sideways floating. So,
Yeah.
and this was very early in my Kickstarter career. I was so concerned. I sent people links to like the weather report thing to show, look, here's the hurricane. We don't want to send these books through the hurricane. So it's going to be another month, right? Because then the boats go on a certain schedule.
Right.
Um, but the key is on all that stuff, communication, right? You let people know what's going on. Then they get the product, and then they invest, and they're comfortable investing. I did a book recently, again on Kickstarter. We did a second edition of this book, Right or Wrong: A Writer's Guide to Creating Comics. This is my pay it forward book in regards to how do you traverse that stuff. And one of the biggest things is communicate and just keep your word on what you're going to do, right? And as a result, that's why now I've run over a dozen Kickstarter campaigns. And again, we're closing in on I'll be the $500,000 man, right? I'll get half the belt and I'll carry it around. you know, but that's also a privilege and an honor that I don't take for granted either. I'm to a point now where I want to start being able to run two Kickstarters back to back, but I don't ever want to have more than two books that are fulfilled. We just did the Kickstarter for the second volume of the book Hope, which I showed you a moment ago. We did the Kickstarter for this. We're getting everyone order fulfillment now, and then when the day I send this book to the printer is the day I'm going to launch my next Kickstarter for a Native American Western werewolf comic called Homestead. People know they're going to get Hope, and then they're going to get Homestead, and then when Hope delivers, Homestead will be at the printer, and then I'll do the next one. And I think my crowd is comfortable enough this way, knowing that stuff's going to come through.
Right.
But again, you don't take that for granted. You offer a very high value and you communicate open and honestly with people about the process. You can't let shame run your game. I was very embarrassed about the fact that this book was stuck in customs. But then I'm like, there's nothing I can do about it. I literally could have driven to California and gone and like knocked on the door. They're not going to give me the book sooner. I just got to tell people, look, friends, it's done. I promise it's done. It's just sitting there. So just be open and honest. Just communicate with people. And then as a result, they'll come back to you again and again. And again, hopefully some of these Arn Anderson fans will say, this was a really good book. Oh, Dirk's doing like a Native American Western werewolf story, and it's a one and done book. Okay, that sounds interesting. I'll check that out.
Right.
And then maybe they'll go backwards and forwards. You talking about the fact you like horror anthologies. I kind of snuck in a plug. I've got this book, Nightmare World, that's coming out next month. Real good one. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. You can pre-order it now through Barnes and Nobles. You might like it. So that's the nature of the work as a creator, is continuing to fulfill, continuing to offer high value content, and then hoping that people will be reciprocal to that. And I've been very fortunate thus far that they have been, and that's something I'm very grateful for.
Well, the homestead one does sound like something that caught my attention. That you mentioned it because I like wolves. The Native American people I have great respect for. I lived in the state of Rhode Island where you had uh, towns like Narragansett, which is a Native American name
Oh yeah.
and all types of stuff. Yeah, I'm excited about a lot of the things that you're saying, and for me, during the pandemic, Dirk, I got so frustrated with my screenplays that I've written, like 10 or 12 feature film screenplays, and
Hmm.
only a few of them have actually been made. So I started adapting my screenplays into novels through
Right.
through Amazon, through their Amazon KDP, because
Yep.
I didn't want to go down that path of sending out query letters to Simon and Schuster or to whoever, because to me that was too reminiscent of, as a filmmaker, trying to get other people's money to make a movie, or trying to send a finished short film to a festival. Basically, I didn't want to look for anyone else's approval. I wanted to go straight to the market. So that's, I did the A Distance from Avalon is basically my gothic horror magical realism story. And
Right.
and I just and then I did another one, Fighter Play Basketball, which you would appreciate this. I've this is the published book, which I've got these clips from the Dollar Tree, because
Right.
now I'm finding, like, man, I've got sentences in this book which are perfectly fine, but like, say it's a 20-word sentence, I think I can get that sentence down to 18 or 14 words. So now I'm painstakingly going through my already published book and
Yeah.
redrafting it. But here's the good thing, Dirk, with, and I know I'm putting over Amazon here, but with the Amazon KDP, I
Yep.
can do that and not have to ask an editor or a publisher for permission, or, hey,
Yep.
I'm going to go into the file and tweak it and make a second edition and make my 20-word sentences to 14. If that was a major publisher, Reagan Books or whoever, they would not care if I wanted to change my 20-word sentence to 14 words. They would not understand, in my opinion, as a writer. You have what the term I want to use for you too is pride of authorship. And
Right.
uh, and I think of my time talking with Vince Russo. I've been on his podcast, and I think a lot of problems that Vince Russo had with the WWE is they did not want to give him credit. They didn't want to give anyone but Vince McMahon credit for the writing of the storylines, because they want to think that the McMahons do this thing on their own. And Vince Russo, like yourself and like me, had what I call pride of authorship. When you're a
Right.
creator and you're putting your ass on the line and you're putting your time into your computer, and as you a lifelong horror fan, a lifelong wrestling fan, you have pride of authorship, which I just don't think that a lot of people get. That even the audience doesn't get it sometimes, and I'm afraid on some level that with AI, a thing which can be used as a tool, and it can also be used as a replacement for human beings. I hope that pride of authorship does not get sacrificed along the way of technology, Dirk.
No, no, you're exactly right. And obviously the AI thing in the world of art for comics especially is a huge thing right now. And then obviously with writers it's becoming more and more of a thing too. And ultimately what it comes down to is we have to put things into the world that only we can create. Right. And when I did the first edition of Right or Wrong, I talked about how, I was young and full of piss and vinegar when I did the first edition of this book. And I'm like, if you write something that comes from your heart, gosh darn it, it's going to be almost impossible for other people to steal it. Then AI comes around.
Right. Record
And I'm like,
skip. The record skip.
ooh. I'm like, yeah, maybe not. And in my own career, I've had my work very heavily influence other existing works to the point where perhaps I should have been given more credit than I was. And we'll leave it at that. Right. But you're right. Ultimately, what it comes down to, though, as creators, in regards to that pride of authorship, is produce it, do it. And I really appreciate what you were saying about how you want to write screenplays, but then you switch to novels to get it done, because that's it. I can have it done on my desktop. I can have it done sitting in my drawer. I can have it done in my head. It's not, but it doesn't really exist till it's out there. Right over here in my office, I have a spinner rack, an old timey comic book spinner rack that is almost filled with my own work. Right. And that was always been like a goal for me, is like someday I want to fill a spinner rack, not just with issues, but with graphic novels of my own work. And the only way to make that happen is to produce it and get it done. And that's why it's so funny that people in film love comics, people in comics love film. But it's like that grass is always green on the other side thing. And I'm always like, no, man, I'm going to do the books. I'm going to do the books. And that's why I haven't chased that dragon of like writing a Spider-Man, writing an X-Men. There's a million people that want to write X-Men. Everyone has a Spider-Man story. Everyone has a Batman story. If you write comics at all, even though I've never been a superhero guy, you have a story like that you can do. And you can chase that dragon and have to, talk to editors, butter them up, and then do your other thing. No, man, look, I want to put in my books. I want to make them real. So I give kudos to you again. And you're right. Amazon's print on demand work is a wonderful way to get your stuff out. I talk about that a lot in Right or Wrong. Just get the book. Yeah, you have the thing. You have done the thing that more than 99% of people that talk about it, or less than that do. You have the book, and that's powerful, and that's to be commended. And then you do the next one. And again, I have to go back and make sure when I publish a book, sometimes I'll go back and read it for like 6 months, because it's like, again, I have great editors, I have great publishers, but like, oh, what if there's something I would have done differently? And I have to get to that place where I'm like, woosah, okay, I'm going to pick up Arn Anderson and I'm going to read this book. Even though I've read it on the screen 100 times, it's a process. It's all a process. But I tell people all the time when I do panels on writing and things like that, the only thing better than a perfect book is a finished book. The only thing better than finished.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Say that again, please.
I said the only thing better than perfect is finished. Finish it. Put it out. Do the next one.
We're pulling up on 2:00. I know you have a 2:00 appointment, so I want to let you go. But I think the only thing we can do here, Dirk, is to have it to be continued, because I think we have even more to talk about. And I think in another,
I appreciate that.
whenever you're available, whether it's a week or 2 weeks or a month from now, there's so much more on the bone of this conversation. But I do know that you have an appointment today, and I want to let you get to that. So DIRKManning.com, and Dirk, I'll give you the final 30 to 60 seconds. Go ahead.
Yeah, DIRKManning.com is my website. You can sign up for my newsletter. You store your email in there. I send out a newsletter once a month. It's directly from me, not on any lists, nothing like that. That's how you find out about the Arn Anderson book. You'll find out about the Homestead Kickstarter launching in February. I'm also on social media, Facebook, Instagram, God help me, Twitter, X, YouTube, at Dirk Manning. Look for the avatar, the guy at the top hat and the scarf. That's me. But I tell people the best thing is I send a newsletter once a month. But if you want to do more passive communication, passive contact, Instagram, Facebook, at Dirk Manning, check that out. DirkManning.com has my full bibliography. I'd love to stay in touch. And again, man, thank you not only so much for backing the Arn Anderson book, but thanks for taking the time to chat with me. I love talking to fellow creators and fans of the medium. So thank you, man. I appreciate your time.
This is Mike Messier with Dirk Manning. We'll see you next time. MikeMessier.com, DirkManning.com. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.